You know what they say about military parades? Well, actually, nobody says anything about them because most species are smart enough not to waste their time with such ridiculous displays of ego. But here I was, Junior Officer Kelp of the Zephyrian Defense Corps, standing at attention while our glorious forces marched across the crimson sands of Corax Prime. The morning sun cast long shadows as our mechanized units thundered past the reviewing stand. Hover tanks the size of small buildings glided effortlessly above the parade ground, their weapon systems gleaming like polished death. Behind them, columns of our finest warriors marched in perfect synchronization, each one standing nearly 3 meters tall, their chitinous armor plates catching the light like mirrors made of nightmares. The crowd of alien dignitaries seated in the viewing pavilion seemed properly impressed. Representatives from a dozen worlds watched with what I hoped was awe, though honestly, it might have been indigestion from the morning's diplomatic breakfast. The Canthari ambassador was busy taking notes, probably calculating how many credits it would cost to hire us for their border disputes. The Vorthan delegation whispered among themselves, their tentacles writhing in what passed for excitement in their species. But the real spectacle was yet to come, as the final squadron of atmospheric fighters screamed overhead in a formation that spelled out, "Invincible," in ancient Zephyrian script. The crowd's attention turned to the massive figure stepping up to the podium. General Thane Blackwood was, without question, the most arrogant pile of muscle and attitude I had ever had the misfortune to serve under. Standing 4 meters tall, even by our generous standards, his obsidian exoskeleton bore the scars of 100 battles and twice as many bar fights. His forearms moved with predatory grace as he adjusted the microphone, and his compound eyes swept across the assembled crowd like searchlights looking for trouble. Honored guests, his voice boomed across the parade ground, enhanced by speakers that made him sound like the voice of some angry deity. You have witnessed today the might of the Zephyrian military machine. For 3 centuries, our forces have remained undefeated in battle. The crowd erupted in polite applause. Well, the ones with hands applauded. The others made various noises that I assumed were complimentary. Thane raised his upper right arm for silence. We have conquered the savage Breltech hordes of the Outer Rim. We have crushed the mechanical armies of the Synthetic Collective. We have even defeated the legendary berserkers of Fenris Prime in single combat. His voice dropped to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper, but still carried clearly across the entire complex. And yet there are those who question our supremacy. Oh no, I could see where this was going. Thane had that look in his compound eyes, the same one he got right before he challenged the bartender to arm wrestling contests or declared war on neighboring star systems because their diplomatic pouches were the wrong shade of blue. The humans, he continued, and I swear I could hear the collective intake of breath from the diplomatic corps, seem to think they are our equals in combat prowess. Several of the alien ambassadors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Canthari representative actually dropped his stylus. Everyone in the galaxy knew that insulting the humans was generally a bad idea, not because they were particularly fearsome, but because they had this annoying habit of making you regret it in ways you never saw coming. But Thane was just getting started. These soft pink creatures, barely 2 meters tall and lacking any natural weapons whatsoever, have somehow convinced half the galaxy that they are warriors to be respected. He let out a sound that was probably meant to be laughter, but came out more like the screech of metal on metal. I have seen their soldiers, pathetic beings who require artificial armor just to survive in a decent atmosphere. They cannot even digest properly fermented grain alcohol without falling unconscious. The crowd was getting distinctly uncomfortable now. Ambassador Flux, our own diplomatic liaison, was making frantic hand signals to try to get Thane to change the subject, but our dear general was far beyond the reach of reason at this point. In fact, Thane declared, puffing out his chest plates until he looked like an armored balloon about to burst, I hereby state for the record that no human warrior, no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced, could possibly break through my personal combat guard. That's when the universe decided to have a laugh at our expense, because at that exact moment, as if summoned by some cosmic sense of irony, a human diplomatic vessel appeared on the horizon. The ship was typical human design, sleek, efficient, and completely unremarkable. It settled onto the designated landing pad with the kind of gentle precision that suggested the pilot had done this about 10,000 times before. The boarding ramp lowered with a soft hydraulic hiss, and out stepped what had to be the most ordinary-looking group of humans I had ever seen. Leading them was a woman who looked to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple knot, and wearing what appeared to be a standard diplomatic uniform. She was maybe 1.7 meters tall, slightly built, and moved with the unhurried pace of someone who had better things to do than be impressed by military parades. Captain Sarah Mills of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, announced the protocol droid that accompanied every official arrival. Here for the scheduled trade negotiations. Perfect timing, absolutely perfect. Thane's compound eyes fixed on Captain Mills like targeting systems locking onto their prey. A slow, predatory grin spread across his mandibles. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground through the still-active speakers. "It seems the universe has provided us with an opportunity for a demonstration. I wanted to hide behind my ceremonial pike. This was not going to end well for anybody involved, but especially not for me, because I had a sinking feeling I was going to end up filling out the incident reports." Captain Mills approached the reviewing stand with that same unhurried pace, apparently oblivious to the fact that she had just walked into what was about to become the most embarrassing moment in Zephyrian military history. Behind her, 2 other humans followed, a younger man in a uniform that marked him as military aide, and an older woman carrying what looked suspiciously like a medical kit. "General Thane Blackwood," Mills said, her voice calm and professional as she offered what I later learned was called a handshake, a peculiar human greeting ritual. "I'm here for the trade discussions, but I couldn't help overhearing your interesting speech." Ignored the offered hand and loomed over her instead. "Captain Mills, how fortuitous. You arrived just in time to witness a demonstration of Zephyrian superiority." Mills looked up at him with the kind of expression I had seen my grandmother use when the neighbors' juveniles got too loud during molting season. Polite, but with an undertone that suggested she was already tired of this conversation. "Oh really?" she said. "What kind of demonstration? Now let me explain something about Zephyrian physiology that might help you understand just how ridiculous this situation was about to become. We Zephyrians are built like living siege engines. Our exoskeletons can deflect plasma bolts. Our muscle density is roughly 3 times that of most carbon-based life forms. We have 4 arms, each capable of crushing steel beams, and our reaction times are measured in microseconds rather than the sluggish milliseconds that most species require to process danger. General Thane Blackwood was exceptional, even by our standards. I had personally watched him tear the turret off a hover tank during the siege of Gamma Station. During the Battle of the Iron Nebula, he had single-handedly held off an entire squad of Breltech shock troopers while our engineers repaired the shield generators. The man had never lost a fight, never backed down from a challenge, and had the kind of combat record that made other generals weep into their fermented beverages. And he was about to pick a fight with a middle-aged human woman who looked like she should be teaching juveniles how to calculate hyperspace coordinates. The irony was so thick you could have used it to armor a battleship. But here's the thing about Zephyrian military culture. We love a good spectacle almost as much as we love proving our superiority. When word spread through the base that General Thane was going to demonstrate proper combat technique on a human volunteer, well, let's just say productivity dropped to approximately 0%. Within minutes, soldiers began appearing from every corner of the base. They came from the barracks, the mess halls, the maintenance bays, and what I suspected were several off-duty recreational establishments that technically didn't exist according to military regulations. The parade ground, which had been clearing out after the official ceremony, suddenly found itself hosting the largest impromptu gathering in recent memory. Maintenance crews abandoned their hover lifts to get a better view. Kitchen staff emerged from the depths of the commissary, still wearing their aprons and carrying various implements of food preparation. Even the base medical staff showed up, though I noticed they had the good sense to bring stretchers and emergency equipment. The alien dignitaries who had been preparing to leave for their scheduled diplomatic luncheon suddenly found reasons to stay. The Canthari ambassador was frantically adjusting his recording equipment. The Vorthan delegation had wrapped their tentacles around the railing of the viewing platform and were making excited chittering sounds. Even the normally stoic granite lords of Petra Prime seemed interested, which was remarkable because they usually found watching paint dry more exciting than most forms of entertainment. This should be educational," commented Ambassador Flux nervously, though I noticed he had positioned himself near the emergency exit. Meanwhile, General Thane was basking in the attention like a solar panel in a supernova. He flexed his 4 arms in sequence, each movement producing audible pops from his joints that sounded like small explosions. His exoskeleton gleamed in the afternoon sun as he performed what I could only describe as a victory dance, despite the fact that the victory in question had not yet occurred. "Behold," he announced to the growing crowd, the soft weakness of humanity exposed for all to see. Captain Mills, meanwhile, had removed her diplomatic jacket and was folding it with the kind of precise movements that suggested she did everything with exactly the same methodical care. She handed it to her aide, Commander Stone, who accepted it with an expression that suggested he had seen this particular show before. "You know," Mills said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than her impending humiliation, "I have to admit, this is a first for me. Usually people wait until after the trade negotiations to threaten violence." The crowd laughed, though I don't think they understood why. Humans have this peculiar habit of making jokes when they should be running for their lives. Thane's compound eyes narrowed. "You find this amusing, human? You should be honored. Few beings have had the opportunity to be personally defeated by the greatest warrior in Zephyrian history." "Oh, absolutely," Mills replied, beginning what appeared to be a series of stretching exercises. "I'm practically beside myself with excitement." "Should I be taking notes? For the honor, I mean?" More confused laughter from the crowd. I was beginning to suspect that humans and Zephyrians had very different definitions of appropriate pre-combat behavior. "You mock me?" Thane's voice rose to what was probably audible from orbit. "Not at all," Mills said, touching her toes with casual ease. "I'm just trying to understand the rules here. Is this a formal challenge? Because if it is, I should probably mention that I'm not actually a combat specialist. I'm a diplomat. My job involves sitting in uncomfortable chairs and pretending to care about trade tariffs." The crowd was murmuring now, and I could catch fragments of conversation in a dozen different languages. The general consensus seemed to be confusion about why a human diplomat would voluntarily enter combat against a Zephyrian general, followed by speculation about human mental health services. "Combat specialist or not," Thane declared, "you are human. Your species claims to be warriors. I will prove otherwise." Mills paused in her stretching routine and looked up at him with what I was beginning to recognize as a dangerous expression. It was the same look my grandmother got when someone suggested that her cooking was merely adequate rather than transcendent. "I see," she said quietly, "so this is about proving something. Now here's where cultural differences become important. To a Zephyrian, combat is about dominance, strength, and the demonstration of superior physical capabilities. We fight to prove who is stronger, faster, more powerful. Victory goes to the being with the biggest weapons, the thickest armor, and the loudest battle cry. Humans, as I was about to learn, have a somewhat different approach to conflict resolution." The crowd was getting restless. Soldiers were placing bets on how long the fight would last. The current favorite was less than 5 seconds, with exactly one punch running a close second. The medical staff had positioned themselves optimally for rapid human retrieval. The diplomatic corps was already preparing what I assumed were standard apology forms for when they had to ship Captain Mills' remains back to Earth. "Perhaps," suggested Ambassador Flux hopefully, "we could resolve this through a less physical demonstration, a chess match perhaps, or comparative poetry recitation?" Both Thane and Mills turned to look at him with expressions that suggested poetry was not going to solve this particular diplomatic crisis. "No," Mills said firmly, "if the general wants a demonstration, he should get one." She rolled her shoulders with motions that looked almost casual, but produced a series of small popping sounds that suggested her joints were being systematically prepared for action. When she looked back up at Thane, her entire demeanor had shifted in a way that was difficult to define but impossible to miss. "Just to be clear," she said, her voice carrying a note that made several of the closer soldiers take involuntary steps backward. "You're challenging me to single combat? In front of witnesses? With your reputation on the line?" Thane puffed out his chest plates even further. "I am. And when I crush you, tiny human, the entire galaxy will know that Zephyrian strength is supreme." Mills nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "Understood, and there's no backing down from this challenge. No diplomatic way to resolve things peacefully?" "None," Thane roared. "Prepare yourself for defeat." "Right then," Mills said, and smiled. That smile, I would later realize, should have been our first warning that everything we thought we knew about humans was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The fight, if you could call it that, began exactly the way everyone expected it to. General Thane Blackwood, all 4 meters of armored death and bad attitude, raised his primary right arm and brought it down in a crushing blow that should have reduced Captain Mills to a small, diplomatically embarrassing stain on the parade ground. The keyword here being should have. Instead, Mills took one small step to her left, and Thane's fist connected with nothing but air and a few startled dust particles. The general, thrown off balance by the unexpected absence of human resistance, stumbled forward slightly, his compound eyes widening in what I can only describe as professional confusion. "Interesting technique," Mills commented politely, as if she were reviewing a junior officer's performance report. "Very committed. Perhaps a bit too committed." The crowd was already murmuring. This wasn't going according to script. Thane should have been holding up his victory trophy by now, preferably something that had recently been attached to Captain Mills. Thane recovered quickly, credit where credit is due. He spun around, bringing his secondary left arm in a sweeping backhand that could have decapitated a hoverbike. Mills ducked under it with the kind of fluid motion that suggested she had been expecting exactly that attack. "Much better," she said, still in that same conversational tone. "Though I have to ask, is the spinning really necessary? Seems like it might leave you a bit exposed." And that's when I saw it, that exact moment when General Thane Blackwood, undefeated champion of 100 battles, terror of 3-star systems, and the most arrogant pile of military muscle in known space, realized he had made what military tacticians call a significant strategic error. His third attack was more cautious, a probing jab with his lower right arm. Mills caught his wrist. Now, to be clear, this should have been physically impossible. Thane's arm was roughly the thickness of a tree trunk, covered in natural armor plating, and backed by enough muscle to punch through a bulkhead. Mills' hand barely wrapped halfway around his wrist, but she caught it and held it, and Thane, for the first time in his military career, found himself unable to move his arm. "You know," Mills said, her voice still carrying that same pleasant, diplomatic tone, "I really did try to avoid this. I had such nice plans for lunch." Thane tried to pull free. Nothing happened. He tried harder, his other 3 arms bracing against the ground for leverage. His exoskeleton creaked with the strain. The muscles in his shoulders bulged until they looked like they might burst from his armor. Mills continued to hold his wrist with apparent ease, looking for all the world like she was shaking hands at a particularly boring reception. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the Vorthan delegation had stopped their excited chittering. This was not how physics was supposed to work. "Let me explain something about human military philosophy," Mills continued, as if she were delivering a lecture rather than wrestling with a 4-meter alien warrior. "We don't fight to prove we're strong, we fight to win." And then she moved. I wish I could describe what happened next in terms that would make sense to someone who wasn't there. Military combat analysts would later study the security recordings frame by frame, and they still couldn't agree on exactly how she did it. All I can tell you is that one moment Thane was straining against her grip, and the next moment he was airborne. Not flying, mind you. Humans can't actually fly despite what some of the more excitable species claim, but he was definitely not touching the ground, and he was rotating in ways that 4-armed beings are not typically designed to rotate. He landed hard, face first in the parade ground dirt, with Mills somehow still holding his wrist in what had become a very uncomfortable-looking angle. "The thing is," Mills continued, completely ignoring the fact that she had just thrown a creature twice her size through the air like a bag of grain, "we've had thousands of years to figure out efficient ways to hurt each other. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you put your mind to it." Thane tried to push himself up with his free arms. Mills shifted her grip slightly, and he immediately went very still. "I wouldn't," she advised. "Right now your arm is experiencing what we call mechanical disadvantage. If you move the wrong way, several important things are going to break." The crowd was making sounds I had never heard before. Some were whimpers. Some were what I assumed were prayers in various alien languages. The Kanthari ambassador was frantically scribbling notes, possibly updating his species' threat assessment of humanity. "Now then," Mills continued, her tone still perfectly reasonable, "I believe you were making some claims about human weakness?" Thane, his face pressed firmly into the dirt, managed to grunt what might have been a response. "I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you speak up?" "I yield," Thane gasped. "Excellent. See how much easier things are when we communicate properly?" And then came the sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Crack. It wasn't particularly loud, certainly not as impressive as the sound of Thane's fist hitting the air, or his body hitting the ground, but it carried across the parade ground with perfect clarity, and every being present knew exactly what they had just heard. Mills had broken General Thane Blackwood's arm. Not crushed it in a fit of rage, not mangled it in a desperate struggle. She had applied precise, calculated pressure to exactly the right point, at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right amount of force to snap the bone cleanly in half. "Oh dear," she said, with the same tone someone might use to comment on a minor scheduling conflict. That sounded expensive. The silence that followed was the kind of complete, absolute quiet that usually only exists in the vacuum of space. 1,000 beings stood frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. General Thane Blackwood, the undefeated champion, the terror of 3-star systems, the pride of the Zephyrian military, was lying face down in the dirt with his arm bent at an angle that would have made a geometry teacher weep. And Captain Sarah Mills, Diplomat, was standing over him, brushing dust off her hands with the casual air of someone who had just completed a particularly mundane task. "Well," she announced to the stunned crowd, "that was educational. I do hope everyone learned something today." The medical staff, who had been frozen in shock like everyone else, suddenly remembered they had jobs to do and rushed forward with their equipment. Mills stepped back politely to give them room, straightening her uniform blouse as if nothing unusual had happened. Commander Stone approached with her jacket. "Ma'am, the Zephyrian medical team is asking about proper treatment protocols for human-inflicted injuries." "Oh, it's just a simple fracture," Mills replied cheerfully. "Nothing a good bone regenerator can't fix." Though he might want to consider physical therapy afterward. His form really was quite poor. Ambassador Flux materialized beside me, his face the color of week-old vegetation. "Junior Officer Kelp," he whispered, "I believe we may need to revise our intelligence reports on human combat capabilities." I nodded weakly, still staring at the scene before us. "Yes, sir. I believe we may need to revise quite a few things." As the medical team worked to stabilize General Thane's arm, Captain Mills accepted a towel from Commander Stone and began cleaning her hands with the methodical care of someone who had done this sort of thing before, many times before. "I suppose," she said, addressing the still stunned crowd, "some explanations are in order." The alien dignitaries leaned forward like students in a particularly important lecture. Even the medical staff paused in their work to listen. "You see, before I became a diplomat, I spent 22 years in the Terran Marine Corps. Specifically, I was a drill instructor at the Advanced Combat Training Facility on Luna Base. My job was teaching young humans how to kill things efficiently." The crowd made various sounds that I interpreted as expressions of dawning horror. "The thing about humans," Mills continued, settling into what was clearly a well-practiced explanation, "is that we're not naturally the strongest, or the fastest, or the most heavily armored species in the galaxy. We're actually quite fragile, when you get right down to it, so we've had to get creative." She gestured toward the still prone form of General Thane. "Your general there made the classic mistake of assuming that combat effectiveness is directly proportional to size and natural weaponry. It's an understandable error. Most species think that way." Ambassador Flux found his voice first. "But how? His exoskeleton alone should have—" "Oh, exoskeletons are wonderful," Mills agreed. "Excellent protection against blunt force trauma, energy weapons, environmental hazards. But they have joints, and joints are mechanical systems, and any mechanical system has failure points if you understand the engineering." The Canthari ambassador was scribbling notes so frantically I thought his stylus might catch fire. "You studied our anatomy? Our weaknesses?" Mills looked genuinely surprised. "Of course. How else would we conduct proper diplomatic relations? The first rule of human diplomacy is to understand exactly how to kill everyone you're negotiating with. That way, when we choose not to kill them, they know it's because we're being polite, not because we can't." The silence that followed this statement was profound enough to have its own gravitational field. "You see," Mills continued, apparently oblivious to the existential crisis she was causing, "humans have been fighting each other for our entire evolutionary history. We've developed martial arts, specifically designed to defeat opponents who are bigger, stronger, and better armed than we are. It's not about strength. It's about leverage, timing, and knowing exactly where to apply pressure." She paused to accept a water bottle from Commander Stone. "In my particular case, I specialized in what we call non-lethal restraint techniques. The idea is to subdue opponents without causing permanent damage. Though I'll admit, General Thane's arm will probably ache when the weather changes." The medical team had finished loading Thane onto a hover stretcher. As they prepared to transport him to the medical facility, he managed to lift his head enough to look at Mills. "What are you?" he asked weakly. Mills smiled, the same pleasant diplomatic smile she had worn throughout the entire encounter. "Just a middle-aged woman trying to do her job, General. Nothing more, nothing less." As the medical team departed with their patient, the crowd began to disperse, though I noticed that everyone was giving Captain Mills a much wider berth than when she had arrived. The alien dignitaries were huddled in small groups, presumably updating their threat assessments and revising their negotiation strategies. The realization was spreading through the gathering like ripples in a pond. If this ordinary-looking human diplomat could casually disable our greatest military champion, what did that say about the rest of her species? What did it say about human soldiers? Human warriors? Human civilization as a whole? We had been thinking about humans all wrong. They weren't weak, they weren't primitive, they were just efficient. Mills finished her water and handed the empty bottle back to Commander Stone. She looked around at the thinning crowd, then at her chronometer. "Well," she announced cheerfully, "that was invigorating. Though I have to say, I was taking it pretty easy on him, didn't want to cause an diplomatic incident." The few remaining aliens exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering everything they thought they knew about diplomatic incidents. "Now then," Mills continued, smoothing down her uniform, "I believe someone mentioned lunch. All this light exercise has given me quite an appetite. I do hope you have something vegetarian. And perhaps we could discuss those trade agreements while we eat." And with that, Captain Sarah Mills, retired Marine drill instructor turned diplomat, walked off toward the diplomatic dining facility, leaving behind a parade ground full of aliens who were suddenly very, very glad that humans preferred negotiation to conquest. As for me, well, I had some very interesting reports to file.